Dusty Creek was a scar on the land, a line of raw wood buildings baking under the Arizona Territory sun in 1875. The main street was just a river of pale dust, fed by the saloons, the livery stable, and a small, hopeful church with a steeple that looked too thin to carry the weight of its own bell. A few miles out, beyond the last struggling homestead, the United States Army had its fort, a place that felt more like a cage than a bastion. The air itself was thin and tight, stretched like a drum skin. Every conversation in the saloons, every sermon in the church, eventually came around to the Apache. The word was spoken like a curse. They were savages, ghosts in the rocks who struck wagon trains and left nothing behind but ash and missing people. Every white man in Dusty Creek carried a firearm, and every white woman looked over her shoulder. The soldiers drilled under the hot sun, their blue uniforms dark with sweat, waiting for the order to kill. Into this street walked Eleanor Hart. She was 27 years of age, and she was the living stain on Dusty Creek's pioneer pride. She moved from the general store, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper held tight in her hand, and the town watched her. The women, gathered in a knot of calico and judgment by the mercantile, stopped their talk, their whispers, sharp as grit, carried on the dry air. That woman, shameful. No decent man will take her now. The men, lounging on the saloon porch, spat tobacco juice into the dust and let their eyes linger on her in a way that was its own kind of violation. It was a look that stripped her bare and found her wanting, all in the same glance. Ellie, they called her, but never to her face anymore. She was just her. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed on the broken boardwalk beneath her feet. She knew what they said. She had been the daughter of the innkeeper, a bright girl who had gone east for a little schooling and come back to teach literacy to miners' children. Then her father had been crushed in a silver mine collapse just outside of town. Her mother, hollowed by grief, had followed him 6 months later, taken by a fever that burned the last of her life away. The inn, her family's legacy, had been swallowed by debt, debts held, conveniently, by Marshall Everett Clay. Now she lived by helping at that same inn, cleaning room she once owned, serving whiskey to men she would not look in the eye. The new inn mistress, a woman with a face like a dried apple, paid her in scraps and the right to a small, airless room in the back. She had had offers. Oh, the town knew about the offers. A merchant from Tucson, old enough to be her grandfather, had offered a handsome sum for her hand. A gambler with rough hands and whiskey on his breath had tried to claim her. And Marshall Clay himself, the man who held the town in his fist, had made his own proposal. It had sounded less like a request for marriage and more like the terms of a surrender. She had refused them all. That was the beginning of her sin. The true damnation had come 6 months ago. A young cowboy, barely 19, had gotten drunk and loud in the street, shouting that Marshall Clay was skimming taxes. Clay had met him outside the saloon. He had not arrested the boy. He had beaten him with the butt of his pistol, a methodical, terrifying rhythm of bone meeting steel. He had beaten the boy until he stopped moving, and then he had kept beating him. Ellie had seen it all from the inn window, and she, in her madness, had run out and screamed at the marshal. She had called him a murderer in front of the whole town. Clay, wiping the blood from his glove, had just smiled at her. The next day, the rumors started. Ellie Hart had been seen entertaining soldiers in a room. She had been trying to seduce the young cowboy, to set him against the marshal. She was unstable. She was loose. She was a woman who did not know her place, a woman who incited men to violence. The church, led by the stern-faced pastor, had held a day of prayer for her fallen soul. The townspeople, eager to stand on the right side of the power wielded by Marshall Clay, had nodded and agreed. It was easier to believe she was a whore than to believe their marshal was a killer. And so, Eleanor Hart, the teacher, the daughter of the inn, had become the symbol of everything a good woman was not. She was almost to the inn when the sound of hooves and the clinking of chains made her pause. A column of soldiers was riding down the street, dust coating their blue uniforms, and between them, shuffling in the ankle-deep powder, was a line of Apache prisoners. There were perhaps 15 of them, warriors and a few women, all bound. Their faces were impassive, their black hair matted with sweat and dirt. The town stopped to watch this parade of defeated savagery. Men stepped out of the saloons, and women pulled their children close, whispering warnings. Ellie stood on the porch of the inn, her parcel pressed to her chest. She watched them pass. She saw the raw, chafed skin where the ropes bit into their wrists. She saw the exhaustion and the defiant hatred in their eyes. Then one of them looked at her. He was a warrior, perhaps 30 years old, unlike the others, who stared ahead or at the ground. He was scanning the town. His gaze was not hateful, it was cold and sharp, like a piece of flint. He was taking inventory of this place, learning its shape and its weaknesses, even in chains. His eyes met hers. Ellie did not flinch or look away. As the other women did, she held his gaze. She saw a pride in him that nothing, not chains or soldiers, could break, and beneath it, she saw a profound sorrow, a grief for a world that was being torn from him. And he, Kohana, saw something just as strange. He saw a white woman who was not looking at him as if he were a beast in a cage. He saw no fear in her eyes. He saw no pity. He saw a different kind of chain, a different kind of prison, and an anger that matched his own. The look lasted only a second, broken when a soldier shoved him forward. But it had happened. A spark had crossed the chasm. Inside the marshal's office, Everett Clay tilted his chair back, his boots resting on his solid oak desk. He was a thick, powerful man, and he filled the room. Across from him sat Captain Harlan Briggs, the commander of the fort. Briggs was thin and ambitious, his uniform neatly pressed despite the heat. Clay puffed on a cigar. He was telling Briggs that this new Apache trouble was a blessing. It was an opportunity. If the conflict escalated, if the reports of attacks were dire enough, the government in Washington would have to send more troops. More troops meant more money, more contracts for beef and grain, all of which would pass through Clay's hands. And, he pointed out, a good, hard-hitting campaign would clear the Apache out of the high valleys. Those valleys, Clay mused, were perfect for grazing cattle. They were also the only land flat enough for the railroad to lay its tracks. Briggs frowned, his thin lips tight. He said his patrols were finding these attack sites, but the evidence was strange. Clay just smiled, a slow, knowing expression. Of course, the evidence was strange. The men he hired to dress as Apache and burn those wagons were sloppy. But it did not matter. All that mattered was that the report said Apache. The rest was just details. The pressure on Ellie was a constant, dull ache. The pastor stopped her on the street, not to greet her, but to ask if her soul was prepared for judgment. He spoke of the virtue of a quiet, obedient wife. The new inn mistress, Mrs. Gable, would inspect Ellie's work, find some imagined flaw, and remind her that she was lucky to have a roof over her head, lucky that decent folk would even tolerate her presence. She would sigh and say that a good marriage, even to a rough man, was a woman's only salvation. Only one person in all of Dusty Creek spoke to her as if she were still human. Dr. Lydia Monroe was a widow, a woman who had learned medicine from her late husband and continued his practice. She was smart and sharp-tongued, and the town tolerated her only because they needed her to set bones and deliver babies. Ellie had gone to her for a headache that would not quit, a pounding misery behind her eyes. Dr. Monroe had examined her, her hands gentle and professional. She had given Ellie a small bottle of laudanum drops. Waving away the coins, Ellie tried to offer. "You hold your head up, child," the doctor had said, her voice low. "This town is full of cowards. Do not let them make you one." That night, news came from a scout. A ranch 20 miles north had been burned to the ground. This time, the signs were real. It was not Clay's hired thugs. It was Apache. Captain Briggs announced that he was preparing a full punitive campaign to track the hostiles and burn their villages. He would show them the meaning of civilized warfare. Marshal Clay just nodded, his eyes glittering. His private plans were coming together perfectly. That evening, Ellie Hart finished her work. She had scrubbed the saloon floor until her knuckles were raw. She walked out onto the porch of the inn that should have been hers. The sun was setting, a spectacular, violent death of red and orange that bled all over the western sky. It lit the peaks of the distant mountains, turning them a deep, bruised purple. Those were the mountains where the Apache lived. She stood alone, a solitary figure in a faded gray dress, and looked at that impossible, free horizon. She thought of the whispers, of Clay's smile, of the young cowboy's broken body in the dust. She thought of the chained warrior's eyes. Here, she thought, her heart a cold stone in her chest. I am already dead and still breathing. She did not know it, but her life, such as it was over. The question of freedom, of dignity, was no longer a thought. It was about to become a choice, and it would be a choice made in blood. Just as Captain Briggs was finalizing his plans for an all-out assault, a rider galloped in from the fort, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He carried a white flag on a stick, and a message. The news spread through Dusty Creek like a flash fire. The Apache wanted to talk. A message had been left tied to a burned-out fence post on the edge of the territory, signed with the mark of Nietzsche, a respected war leader. It said the Apache would cease their raids and return a captured freighter in exchange for the prisoners the army held, and a guarantee that the soldiers would stay out of the high valleys, their ancestral land. They proposed a meeting in 2 days' time, on the neutral ground of the dry mesa known as Red Table. In his office, Captain Briggs saw it as a transparent ruse. He told Marshal Clay, who had come by to hear the news, that it was the perfect opportunity. He said they would pretend to negotiate, draw their main war party into the open, and wipe them out in a single, decisive volley. It was a chance to end the problem for good. Marshal Everett Clay listened, his thick fingers steepled under his chin. He nodded slowly, but his eyes were calculating, seeing a different, more intricate game. He saw more than just a military trap. He saw a way to solve several problems at once. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble. He told Briggs that the captain's plan was sound, but it lacked a certain finesse. The Apache were not fools. They would be watching for a trap. They needed a gesture of good faith, something to make them lower their guard. He said they needed a gift. Briggs scoffed. He was not in the business of giving those savages anything but lead. Clay smiled, that slow, cold smile that never reached his eyes. He said he was not talking about rifles or whiskey. He was talking about something the town could well and truly spare. He said, "Let us give them the woman." Captain Briggs just stared at him, confused. Clay elaborated. He said, "That Hart woman, Eleanor Hart, the whole town knew she was trouble. A loose-tongued, immoral woman who thought she was better than everyone else. She had no family, no protector. No one wanted her. She was a stone in the town's shoe." His logic was a cold, twisting blade. He explained that they would present her as a peace offering, a woman given to the chief. It was the kind of gesture a savage would understand. It would make them think the white men were serious, that they were offering something of value. And if she was the source of the rumors, he said, maybe she had been sleeping with soldiers. Maybe she had been talking to the Apache all along. He painted a picture for Briggs. They would give the Apache the woman no one wanted. It would get her out of Dusty Creek for good, which would quiet the town's moral unrest. It would make the Apache leaders drop their guard, thinking they had received a genuine token of submission. And then, as they were distracted by their new prize, the soldiers, hidden in the rocks above Red Table, would open fire. It was, Clay concluded, a perfect, clean solution. The captain was silent for a long moment, his military mind processing the sheer, brutal pragmatism of the idea. Finally, He gave a short, sharp nod. It was unconventional, but it served the mission. That evening, Marshal Clay called a town meeting. It was not a request. It was a summons. The small church was packed, the air thick with sweat, fear, and the smell of kerosene from the lamps. Marshal Clay stood at the front, next to the pastor. He did not speak of his plan to ambush Nietzsche. He spoke of the Apache threat. He spoke of the burned ranches and the missing men. He spoke of the need for a lasting peace, a peace that would secure their homes for their children. Then, his voice dropping, he spoke of sin. He said that a community must be pure to receive God's protection. He said that when there was a moral rot within the town, it invited disaster. He never said her name. He did not have to. Every eye in that church, furtive and guilty, slid toward Ellie Hart, who sat alone in the last pew. Clay then masterfully planted the seed. He said the Apache had asked for a sign, a token of trust. He said that sometimes, to save the many, one person must be willing to sacrifice. He painted a picture of a town on the brink, a town that needed to purge itself to survive. People began to murmur. A few men, miners and merchants who owed Clay money, nodded in agreement. He is right. The town must be cleansed. The women, who had whispered about Ellie for months, now saw their gossip hardening into a righteous necessity. Only one voice rose in protest. Dr. Lydia Monroe stood up, her small frame rigid with fury. She called Marshal Clay a liar and a hypocrite. She asked the town, her voice shaking, if they were truly so cowardly that they would sacrifice a woman to cover their own fears. She called it what it was, a pagan offering, not a Christian act. Clay let her speak. When she was finished, the silence in the church was absolute. He turned to her, his face a mask of false piety. He said he was sorry to see the good doctor so overwrought. He said perhaps the stress of her work was too much for a woman. He reminded her that her license to practice and the army contract that supplied her with quinine and bandages all passed through his office. Dr. Monroe's face went white. She looked around at her neighbors, at the faces of people whose children she had delivered, whose wounds she had stitched. They stared at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at her. She sat down, defeated. The town had given its silent consent. The next morning, Ellie was scrubbing the inn's porch when two of Clay's deputies approached her. They did not speak. One grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh, and hauled her to her feet. They did not take her to the jail. They took her back to the church. It was not a trial. It was a performance. Marshal Clay sat in the front pew, his hat in his lap. Captain Briggs stood by the door, representing the army, a symbol of official power. The pastor stood at the pulpit. He spoke of Ellie's stubborn pride. He recounted the town's generosity, how they had offered her shelter and work after her parents' tragic passing. He listed the chances she had been given for a respectable life, the offers of marriage she had spurned. He spoke of her public accusation against the town's lawfully appointed marshal, an act of slander that had sown dissent. He said she had been given every chance to repent, to humble herself before God and the community. She had refused. Therefore, the pastor concluded, his voice ringing with false sorrow, the town was placing her in God's hands. The Apache, he said, were instruments of divine will, a scourge sent to test the faithful. The town would send her to the peace talk as a gesture of faith. What happened next would be God's judgment on her soul. Ellie stood between the two deputies, her hands tied loosely in front of her. She had not said a word. She had not cried. She had not begged. She listened to them sign her death warrant, her face pale, her eyes burning with a cold, dry fire. She had no choice. She had never had one. They led her from the church into the bright, cruel sunlight. A wagon was waiting in the street, a farm wagon with a single mule. The entire town was there to watch, a silent, staring crowd. They were watching her like she was a hanging, a grim piece of entertainment. They pushed her onto the back of the wagon. She sat on the rough planks, her bound hands in her lap. She looked at their faces. The merchant she had refused, looking away in shame. The pastor, his hands clasped, praying for her soul and his own justification. Mrs. Gable, the inn mistress, her face tight with grim satisfaction. She was filled with a sudden, searing rage, so potent it almost choked her. She was not afraid. The fear had burned away. Leaving only this, she straightened her back and lifted her chin, staring back at them, forcing them to see the woman they were throwing away. The wagon lurched forward. As it passed the doctor's office, a figure darted into the street, ignoring the deputy's warnings. It was Dr. Lydia Monroe. She ran alongside the wagon, her face etched with desperation. She grabbed Ellie's arm. "Listen to me," she whispered, her voice urgent and fierce. She pressed two small objects into Ellie's bound hands. "You are not what they say you are. Do not let them define you. Do you hear me, child? Do not let them." A deputy shoved the doctor back, and she stumbled, falling to her knees in the dust. The wagon moved on. Ellie looked down. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, felt the objects. One was a small, sharp blade, a surgical knife. The other was a tightly folded paper packet of white powder. Medicine or poison. The doctor had given her a choice. The wagon rolled out of Dusty Creek, leaving the last pretense of civilization behind. 4 soldiers on horseback rode with them, 2 in front, 2 behind. They were not an honor guard. They were a burial detail. Ellie sat on the hard planks, the sun beating on her head, the dust coating her skin. The soldiers did not speak. Their faces were grim. They were riding into Apache territory to spring a trap, and they were bringing a single, unarmed woman as bait. They were just as scared as she was. She looked ahead, toward the saw-toothed purple mountains that cut into the sky, the place the town called Savage. A single, clear thought formed in her mind, hard and sharp as the knife in her hand. They are worse. The men in that town, the pastor, the marshal, they are all worse than the savages they name. If the Apache kill me, at least I will die a free woman, not a thing they can barter and throw away. She was, for the first time, truly alone, and she was ready for whatever came next. The white, civilized world was behind her. The red, savage world was in front, and she was beginning to understand that the names had been put on the wrong things. Red Table was a flat, wind-swept expanse of rock, baking under a white-hot sky. The heat rose in shimmering waves, making the air itself look wounded. Marshal Clay's wagon, with Ellie sitting exposed in the back, stopped at the southern edge. The 4 soldiers fanned out, their horses stamping nervously, their hands never far from their rifles. Captain Briggs sat tall on his horse, his face a mask of military impatience, scanning the ridge line for the hidden riflemen he had already put in place. Ellie could feel the eyes of the soldiers on her back. They were not looking at her as a person, but as a piece of bait. After a long 10 minutes, they appeared. They did not ride in a column like the army. They emerged from the canyons like shadows, a scattered line of perhaps 20 warriors on wiry ponies. They were silent, their bare skin and buckskin blending with the red rock. They were led by 2 men. One was older, his face a map of hard lines, carrying himself with an authority that needed no uniform. This, Ellie sensed, was Naichi. The other, riding at his side, was the man she had seen in chains. He was free now, and he looked entirely different. He wore a simple breechcloth and moccasins, a rifle resting across his lap. His black hair was held back by a strip of red cloth. He rode his horse as if he were part of it. His eyes, just as she remembered, were cold and sharp, and they were fixed not on the soldiers, but on Marshal Everett Clay. The 2 groups stopped, separated by 30 yards of simmering dust. The silence was absolute, broken only by the stamp of a hoof or the jingle of a bridle. Marshal Clay dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He walked into the open space, his hands held wide to show he was unarmed. though the heavy colt on his hip made the gesture a lie. He nodded to Naichi. He said he was a man of peace, here to talk. Naichi spoke, his voice rough as the stone around them. He said in halting English that he was here for the prisoners and for the land. Clay smiled his oily smile. He said, of course, trust was a two-way street. He said he had brought a gift to show his good faith. He turned and walked back to the wagon. He reached up, grabbed Ellie's arm, and yanked her down. She stumbled, her legs stiff, and fell to her knees in the dirt. Her hands, still loosely bound, were scraped raw. Clay hauled her to her feet and pushed her forward into the open. He held her arm in a grip of steel. He announced, his voice booming in the quiet. We give you this woman. She is spirited. No one in our town has a use for her. She is no longer one of us. You can do with her as you wish. He shoved her forward one last time, releasing her. Ellie staggered, catching her balance. She was alone, standing in the dead space between two worlds. From the soldiers, there was a low, nervous chuckle. One of them spat. Captain Briggs looked on, impassive, as if watching a transaction for livestock. A few of the townsmen who had tagged along looked away, a faint flush of shame on their faces before they remembered their loyalty to the marshal. Ellie did not look at them. She looked at the Apache warriors. She felt their eyes on her, 100 sharp points of curiosity and contempt. Then she looked at him, at Kohana. He was watching her, his face unreadable. She did not cry, she did not beg, she did not look at the ground. She wiped the dust from her chin with her bound hands, straightened her back, and stared right back at him. Her eyes were not pleading. They were burning. They were filled with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. She was daring him. She was daring all of them. Kohana saw it all. He saw the dust on her faded dress, the rope burns on her wrists, the raw scrape on her cheek from the fall. But he did not see a victim. He saw a fighter. He saw the woman from the inn, the one who had looked at him in his chains and had not shown fear. He saw a woman who had been broken by her own people, cast out just as his people were being cast out. He saw a spirit that had been hammered into a shape that was all sharp edges and fire. They gave the Apache the woman no one wanted, but he saw what they could not. He saw himself. Naichi, the older chief, was insulted. He looked at Ellie with undisguised contempt. He spoke in his own language, his words sharp and angry. He gestured to her as if she were a piece of garbage. He said, "The white men think we are dogs, that we will accept their trash. We do not need their leftover women." He looked ready to turn his horse and ride away, to let the war begin right there. But Kohana spoke, his voice low and steady, also in Apache. He did not look at Naichi. He kept his eyes on Ellie. He said, "I will take her." Naiche's head snapped toward him. What a white woman. Kohana spoke again. "I will take her. Not for them, for her. Look at her. They brought her here to be killed, either by us or by their own rifles in the trap they have set." He glanced at the high rocks, his eyes narrowing. "I will not let them kill her like a dog." The authority in his voice was unmistakable. He was not asking. Naichi stared at him, then at Ellie, then at the smug face of Marshal Clay. He gave a short, curt nod. This was Kohana's business. Kohana nudged his horse forward, breaking the line of warriors. He rode slowly, deliberately, into the space between the two groups, stopping his horse directly in front of Ellie. He swung down from his pony, landing lightly on his feet. He was taller than she was, lean and hard as ironwood. He walked toward her. Ellie's heart was a hammer against her ribs. The small knife was digging into her palm. This was it. Kohana stopped, just a foot away. He did not touch her. He simply looked at her, his black eyes searching her face. Then he drew a long knife from the sheath on his hip. Ellie tensed, her hand tightening on the surgical blade. He did not lunge. He reached out, swift and clean, and sliced the ropes that bound her wrists. The cut was so precise it did not even graze her skin. The ropes fell into the dust. Ellie stared at her hands, free for the first time that day. She looked up at him, her throat too tight to speak. Kohana put his knife away. He looked past her, at Marshal Clay and Captain Briggs. He spoke in English, his voice slow and clear, carrying across the silence. "From this moment," he said, "they have no right to you." He pointed to Clay, then to Briggs. "They have no more power over you." He turned his gaze back to her. "If you come with me," he said, "I will give you my protection in my own lands. If you stay here, they will finish what they started." He offered her a choice, the first real choice she had had in months. She looked over her shoulder at Marshal Clay, his face now a thundercloud of confusion and rage, his plan already spinning out of his control. At Captain Briggs, his hand now resting on his pistol, his eyes flickering to the rocks where his men were hidden. She saw her murderers. Then she looked at the tall, silent warrior in front of her, a man called a savage, a man who had been her people's prisoner, a man who had just cut her bonds instead of claiming his prize. She saw an unknown, terrifying future, but she also saw the first flicker of respect she had received from any man in a year. She did not hesitate. She took a single step, away from the wagon, away from the soldiers, and stood at Kohana's side. The tension on the mesa broke. Captain Briggs shouted something. Marshal Clay drew his pistol. But Kohana was already moving. He spun, grabbed Ellie's arm, and half threw her toward his horse. "Get up," he yelled. He gave her a push, and she scrambled onto the pony's back, her skirts hiking up, her heart pounding. Naiche and his warriors had their rifles raised, all aimed at the line of soldiers. The negotiation was over. The talk of prisoners and land was forgotten, a lie that had served its purpose. Naiche yelled a command in Apache. Kohana grabbed the lead of a riderless horse, a pack animal, and threw the rope to Ellie. "Hold this!" He swung onto his own horse, landing behind her, his body pressing against her back for a split second. Then he was gone, on his own mount, grabbing her horse's bridle. "They will not shoot," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not while their trap is not ready." He spurred his horse, pulling hers with him. The Apache warriors turned as one, melting back into the rocks they had come from, their rifles still trained on the soldiers. Marshal Clay stood in the open, his face purple. He had been tricked. He had been made a fool of. He raised his pistol, but Captain Briggs rode up and knocked his arm down. "Not now, you idiot," Briggs hissed. "It is not the time, let them go." Clay watched, his chest heaving, as the woman he had tried to throw away rode out of his reach, surrounded by the very savages he meant to destroy. He knew, in that moment, that this was not over. Ellie did not look back. She held onto the horse's mane, her body jolting with the unfamiliar rhythm. Kohana rode beside her, his face set, his eyes scanning the trail ahead. He had not bound her. He had tied her horse's lead to his own, but her hands were free. The group rode hard for an hour, climbing into the foothills, the red rocks swallowing them, the air growing thinner. Only when they were deep in a narrow canyon did Naiche signal a stop. Ellie's legs were shaking so hard she could barely sit the horse. She was sore, terrified, and utterly exhausted. But she was alive. As they rode away from the mesa, she had risked one last glance over her shoulder. The wagon, the soldiers, and the town of Dusty Creek were gone. Just a small, insignificant smudge of dust on the horizon. It was as if the world she knew had been erased. She felt like she had been buried and had dug her way out with her bare hands, only to find herself on a different planet. She was unsteady on the horse, unused to this kind of riding. The animal stumbled on a loose rock, and Ellie pitched forward, letting out a small cry. Before she could fall, Kohana's hand was there. He had been riding beside her, watchful. His hand shot out, his arm a band of steel, catching her around the waist. He steadied her, his grip incredibly strong, half lifting her back into her seat. The contact was a shock to both of them. His hand was warm through the thin fabric of her dress. She was pressed against him for a second, her face close to his shoulder. She smelled leather, horses, sweat, and a clean, dry smell of desert herbs. It was the smell of a man, real and solid. He released her as soon as she was balanced. He did not smile. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his black eyes unreadable. Ellie's face flushed. She was stunned by the simple, impersonal strength of it. He had touched her not with lust, like the men in the saloon, or with violence, like clay. He had touched her to keep her from falling. A tiny, fragile seed had been planted in the barren dust of her heart. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of a question. They rode for hours, deeper and deeper into the mountains, following trails that seemed invisible to Ellie. The land was brutal, a magnificent, sun-scorched expanse of rock and thorns. Just when she thought she could not stay on the horse for one more minute, they turned a sharp corner in the canyon, and the world changed. Before them lay a hidden valley, a slash of impossible green cupped in the hands of the red mountains. A small, clear stream cut through the center, lined with cottonwood trees. Dozens of small, dome-shaped structures, made of bent branches and covered in hides, were scattered among the trees. These were the wickiups. Women looked up from fires, their faces curious. As strips of meat dried on wooden racks in the sun, children, naked or in small shirts, stopped their games with a pack of lean, barking dogs to stare at the newcomers. This was the Apache camp, and it was nothing like the stories. Ellie had been raised on tales of savage lairs, of places filthy with gore and heathen rituals. This was not a lair. It was a village. It was a home. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the clean scent of the pine trees higher on the slopes. She was so stunned by the simple, domestic peace of it that she almost forgot her fear. As the warriors rode in, the camp came alive. People emerged, calling out greetings, but as they saw Ellie, a sudden silence fell. The welcome died, replaced by a low, suspicious murmuring. Kohana dismounted and, without a word, reached up to help her down. His hands were firm on her waist as he lifted her, and she slid to the ground, her legs nearly buckling. He held her arm for a second to steady her. The people stared. The women, especially. Their black eyes were hard and assessing. Some looked at her with open contempt, some with a wary curiosity. A very old woman, her face a web of deep wrinkles, stepped forward. She looked at Ellie, then at Kohana, and spat a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the dust near Ellie's feet. She spoke in Apache, her voice a dry rasp, and though Ellie could not understand the words, the meaning was clear. White skin brings trouble. A young boy, perhaps 14 years of age, with a mischievous grin, nudged his friend. He looked Ellie up and down and called out to Kohana, his voice breaking with laughter. "You bring us a strange bird." "Kohana, does this one sing?" Kohana ignored him, turning instead to Naichi, who had dismounted and was speaking to the old woman, who Ellie now guessed was his mother. The conversation was short and tense, finally. Naichi turned to the small crowd. He pointed a finger at Ellie, and then at Kohana. He spoke loudly, making a formal declaration. "This woman is the business of Kohana," he announced. "He has brought her. He will be responsible for her. If she brings trouble, it is his trouble." Kohana met his gaze and gave a single, sharp nod. He accepted the burden. He turned to Ellie. "Come," he said. He led her away from the center of the camp, past the curious eyes, to a small wickiup set slightly apart from the others, near the stream. It was small, but clean. "You will stay here," he told her. His voice was not unkind, but it was not gentle either. It was a statement of fact. No one will harm you in this lodge. It is mine, but I will sleep with the other men for now." He was giving her space. He was keeping her separate, as much for her own safety as for the peace of the camp. He left her with a skin of water and a strip of dried meat, and then he was gone, disappearing back into the life of the village. Ellie crawled inside the wickiup. The floor was covered in soft furs. It was dark and cool. She sat down, her body aching from the ride, her mind a spinning blur. She was safe from Marshall Clay. She was also a prisoner. She had been saved, only to be put in a different cage. That night was the longest of her life. The sounds of the Apache camp were a symphony of the unknown. She heard the soft murmur of voices speaking a language she could not grasp. She heard the rhythmic beat of a single drum, a sound that seemed to pulse from the earth itself. Later, much later, she heard the call of a wolf from the mountains, answered by the barking of the camp dogs. She clutched the small surgical knife Dr. Monroe had given her, her knuckles white. She thought of the whispers in Dusty Creek, of what they said Apache warriors did to white women. She was terrified of what Kohana would demand of her in return for his protection. But then, she thought of Marshall Clay's face as he shoved her into the dirt, of the pastor's righteous, empty words. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that if she had stayed in Dusty Creek, she would be dead, or worse. Here, she was at least alive, and her fate, for now, was her own. The next day, Kohana came to her wickiup just after sunrise. He carried no weapons, only a small pouch. He did not enter, but spoke to her from the entrance. "The sun here is not like the sun in your town," he said. "It will burn your skin raw." He opened the pouch and showed her a fine, pale yellow powder. "This is from the root of the mescal. Mix it with water. Put it on your face." Ellie, stiff and proud, just stared at him. She was not a child to be ordered. He sighed, a small puff of exasperation. He dipped his own finger in the powder, mixed it with a drop of water from his own skin, and drew a line of the cool paste on the back of his hand. He held it out to her. She looked at him, then at the powder. Her pride warred with the memory of the brutal sun on the ride. She took the pouch from him, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she whispered, the words tasting strange. He nodded. He pointed to the water skin he had left. "That is your water for the day. When you drink, do not gulp it like a white man. Take only a small sip. Let it rest in your mouth. This is the way to make it last." She bristled at the words like a white man. She told him she knew how to drink water. He just looked at her, his face impassive. "You know nothing," he said, not with cruelty, but with simple fact. "You are in our world now. You will learn, or you will die. The sun will not care about your pride. The thirst will not care. They will kill you just the same." He left. Ellie sat, fuming, her face red with more than the sun. But after a few minutes, she mixed the paste and carefully, angrily, applied it to her face and arms. And when she drank, she took only a small sip and held it in her mouth. It was bitter, but he was right. Her presence was a tear in the fabric of the camp. The first few days, she tried to stay in her wickiup, but she could not hide forever. When she emerged to go to the stream, the women would stop their work to watch her. They whispered, and sometimes they would laugh, a sharp, mocking sound. One afternoon, desperate for a moment of peace, she walked away from the stream, following a small path. She did not realize she was walking toward an open space where several of the warriors were gathered in a circle, smoking and chanting in a low voice. It was some kind of ceremony. She had walked right through it. The chanting stopped. The men looked at her, their face masks of cold fury. One of them, a broad-shouldered warrior with a scar on his cheek, jumped to his feet. He strode toward her, his hand raised, his voice a low, guttural snarl. Ellie froze, her blood turning to ice. She had done something wrong, something terrible. The warrior reached her and shoved her, hard. "Pindalik o ye," he spat. white eyes. Ellie stumbled back, falling to the ground. The warrior raised his hand again, to strike her. Enough. The voice was like a whip crack. Kohana was there, stepping between her and the scarred warrior. He had come from nowhere. He stood face to face with the other man, his body a rigid line of challenge. They spoke in Apache, their voices fast and angry. The scarred warrior jested at Ellie, at the sacred space she had violated. Kohana did not move. He spoke in a low, dangerous tone, and the other man's fury seemed to falter. After a long, tense moment, the scarred warrior spat on the ground and stalked back to the circle. The ceremony was broken. Kohana turned to Ellie. He did not offer her a hand. He just watched her scramble to her feet, brushing dust from her dress, her body shaking. "You do not walk there," he said, his voice flat. "That is the place of the men. You do not touch their things. You do not stare at the women. You are a ghost here. You walk quiet. You see nothing." "He was going to hit me," she said, her voice trembling with leftover fear and new anger. "Yes," Kohana said. You insulted his spirits." He grabbed her arm, not gently. "You are not in Dusty Creek. Your anger means nothing here. Your pride means nothing. Here, you are weak. You are trouble. Learn to be invisible." He let her go and walked away, leaving her alone and shaking. But as she walked back to her wiki-up, she realized what had happened. The warrior had been ready to beat her, and Kohana had stopped him. He had publicly faced another warrior for her. He had called her a guest, not a prisoner of war. The words were a shield. He had taken responsibility, and he was honoring it, even when she was a fool. The days settled into a strange, harsh routine. Ellie learned to be invisible. She watched, and what she saw slowly unraveled every story she had ever been told. She saw the old woman who had spat at her, Naichi's mother, sitting with a group of children, telling them a story, her voice soft. The children were revered, treated with a mix of indulgence and strict teaching. When one small boy fell sick with a fever, the entire camp seemed to focus on him. The medicine man chanted for a day and a night, and the boy's mother and aunts never left his side, bathing him with cool water. She saw the elders, the old men and women, treated with a profound respect. They were given the best pieces of meat. They were given the warmest spots by the fire. Their counsel was sought. She thought of Dusty Creek, where the old merchant had been seen only for his money, and where old age was just a burden. When the hunters returned with deer, the meat was not hoarded. It was divided, with strict and complex rules, ensuring every family, every widow, every elder, received a share. Kohana brought her a portion of his own, leaving it by her door without a word. She, the outcast, the trash of the white world, was being fed by the savages. One night, a week after she had arrived, she was sitting outside her wiki-up, watching the stars, which seemed brighter here, sharper. Kohana approached, walking silently, and sat on the ground a few yards away. They sat in silence for a long time. The night sounds of the camp washed over them. "Why did you do it?" Ellie finally asked, her voice quiet. "Why did you take me? They all hate me here." He looked at the fire in the center of the camp. "They do not hate you," he said. "They hate what you are. You are the white world that hunts them. You are the soldier's rifle and the miner's shovel. You are the sickness that kills their children." "I am not," she said, her voice rising. "I am none of those things. My people threw me away." "I know," he said. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the distant fire. "I saw it. That is why I took you. You have the same scar they put on me." She did not understand. He told her, his voice a low monotone, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. He had once been a scout for the white soldiers. He was younger, and he had believed the words of the men in blue, the men who said there could be peace. He believed two peoples could share the land. He had led them, kept them safe, hunted for them. Then, one day, He had led a patrol near his own village, a small, peaceful camp where he had been born. He had gone to see his uncle, the captain, a man he had trusted, had wished him well. When he returned, the village was gone. There was only smoke and silence. The soldiers had ridden in, the ones he trusted. They had killed everyone. The women, the children, his uncle. They had called it a mistake. They said they thought it was a hostile camp. They lied, Kohana said, his voice flat, but his hand was clenched into a fist. There was no mistake. They wanted the land by the stream. He had left that day. He had walked into the mountains, leaving his army jacket, his rifle, and his trust in the white man's world in the bloody dust. He had returned to his people, but he was no longer the same. He had seen too much. He belonged nowhere. Ellie listened, and her heart ached. She understood. She, too, had believed in her world. She had believed in the church, in justice, in community, and she, too, had watched it burn. She had seen the man she was supposed to trust, her marshal, beat a boy to death. She had been cast out by the people she had known all her life. "They betrayed you," she said. "They betrayed themselves," he answered. He rose, a shadow detaching from the dark. He looked down at her. "You try to help the women," he said, surprising her. "I see it. You showed the woman with the cut how to use the hot stone to stop the bleeding, like your doctor." Ellie was stunned. She had done that, a small act, helping a woman who had cut her hand skinning a rabbit. The woman had looked at her, shocked, but had allowed it. "You are not just a complainer," he said. "You learn. Maybe you will not die." He walked away, leaving her with the stars, and with a feeling she had not had in a very long time. It was a fragile, dangerous feeling. It was a thread of trust, as thin as a spider's silk, stretching between two broken worlds. The fragile peace of the valley was shattered by the return of a scout. He rode in hard, his horse near collapse, and went straight to Naiche. The news was bad. The fort near Dusty Creek was a hive of activity. More soldiers had arrived from the south, and, more ominously, 2 wagon trains had been burned on the Tucson Road, with all the signs of an Apache attack. The scout, however, was certain. The tracks were wrong. The bodies had been shot with rifles, not arrows, and left unstripped of their valuables. It was white men's work, crude and loud. It was Clay's work. A council was called, not in a ceremonial circle, but a tight, anxious knot of warriors around Naiche's fire. Kohana stood beside him, his face grim. Ellie, sensing the fear in the air, stayed on the edge, near her wickiup, watching. Kohana saw her. He motioned for her to come. The other warriors fell silent as she approached, their eyes hard. She walked into the firelight, her heart pounding, but she kept her chin high. "Tell them," Kohana said, his voice low. "Tell them what you told me, about the marshal." Ellie looked at Naiche, at the scarred faces of the men who held her life in their hands. She took a deep breath. She spoke of the young cowboy, beaten to death in the street for speaking out. She spoke of her father's inn, swallowed by Clay's manufactured debts, and she told them what she had overheard in the inn, long before she was cast out of Clay, bragging about how a little Indian trouble was the best way to get government contracts and drive settlers off land he wanted. When she finished, there was a heavy silence. Naiche looked at her. His eyes narrowed. "The white man's tongue is forked," he said, his voice a low growl. "He lies when he breathes. This is a war of men. What does a woman, a white woman, know of these things?" "She knows the man," Kohana said, his voice cutting through the tension. "She is the only one in that entire town who stood against him. She is the only one who told the truth. And for it, her people threw her to us. I trust her word more than I trust the paper the white father in Washington signs." He looked at Ellie. "Can you show us?" She was confused. "Show you what?" "The town, the fort, the place where he keeps his power." A new feeling sparked in her. Not fear, but purpose. Yes, she said, I can. That afternoon, in the dirt outside her wickiup, she drew a map with a stick. The other warriors, and even some of the women, watched from a distance as she scratched out the main street of Dusty Creek. She drew the line of saloons, the livery, the church. She drew the fort, a few miles out, marking the commander's office and the barracks. Then she drew two places of high importance. She drew the town's main well, the only reliable water source for miles, and she drew the large, reinforced shed behind the marshal's office. This is his warehouse, she explained, pointing with the stick. It is where he keeps the rifles and ammunition he sells to his hired men. It is where he stores the goods he takes as payment. It is locked, always, but that is his strength. Kohana stared at the map, memorizing it. He saw the town not as a jumble of buildings, but as a living thing, with a throat to be cut, a heart to be stopped. Ellie had given them its weaknesses. She, the powerless woman, had handed them the knowledge that could break the man who had tried to destroy her. The next day, the sky turned a sickly yellow. The air grew still, and the birds stopped singing. Kohana, seeing Ellie outside, barked a sharp command. Get in your lodge, a storm comes. It came not with rain, but with wind. A howling, screaming wind from the west that picked up the desert floor and threw it at the mountains. The air turned to a brown, suffocating grit. The sun was blotted out. The world shrank to a small circle of howling darkness. Ellie huddled in her wickiup, a wet cloth over her mouth, as the structure groaned around her. She thought it would be torn from the earth. The wind sounded like a monster, trying to claw its way in. Suddenly, the flap was ripped open, and a figure stumbled in, half blinded, pushing the flap closed against the storm. It was Kohana. He was covered in dust, his hair and shoulders caked with it. The lodge will not hold, he yelled over the roar of the wind. The stream is flooding the bank. We must move. He grabbed her hand. Come, there is a place. He dragged her out into the blinding, stinging chaos. She could not see. She could barely breathe. The wind ripped the breath from her lungs. He kept his grip on her hand, a single point of anchor in a world turned to madness. He led her up the side of the valley, climbing over rocks, his steps certain even in the brown gloom. He half lifted, half threw her into a shallow opening in the rock face, a small cave or overhang, barely more than a pocket. He scrambled in after her, pulling a stiff piece of hide from his back to hang over the opening. The world went from a deafening roar to a muffled scream. The wind still howled, but the stinging grit was gone. They were in a small, dark space, perhaps 6 feet deep. We wait here, he said. His voice was rough. Ellie was shaking, her teeth chattering. The storm had brought a sudden, shocking cold. The desert heat had vanished. Kohana saw her shivering. He said nothing, but he dug into the small pouch at his belt. He produced a fire drill, a simple stick, and a piece of dry wood. Ellie watched, amazed, as he began to work in the cramped darkness, with patient, powerful strokes. His hands blurred, and in a minute, a tiny coal of red was glowing. He fed it with dry grass he pulled from his pouch, then a few small twigs. A tiny, flickering fire sprang to life, no bigger than a man's hand. It threw their 2 shadows, huge and dancing, against the back of the cave. They sat, huddled over the pathetic flame, the world raging just outside the hide flap. You are still afraid, he said. It was not a question. I am cold, she said, her voice tight. He looked at her. The firelight played in his dark eyes. He is not here. Clay, he is not here. You are safe from him. Am I safe from you? The words were out before she could stop them. They hung in the small, warm space between them. Kohana looked at the fire. I took you, he said, his voice very low. I claimed responsibility for you. I will not harm you. That is not the Apache way, no matter what your people say. He paused. But I cannot let you be harmed, either, by my people, or by the storm, or by him. The cold was seeping into Ellie's bones. She wrapped her arms around herself, but the shaking would not stop. Kohana looked at her, his face a mask. He made a decision. He moved, shifting his body, and sat beside her, his back against the rock wall. He opened the buffalo robe he wore. "Come," he said. She stared at him. "You will freeze," he said, his voice rough with impatience. "This is not for pleasure. It is for warmth. It is to live. Stop thinking like a white woman." She hesitated, her mind screaming with the warnings of a lifetime, but her body, aching with cold, betrayed her. She shuffled closer, her hip and shoulder pressing against his. He was a furnace. His body heat was a shocking, solid wave. He pulled the edge of the robe over her, creating a small tent of shared warmth. They sat in silence for a long time, their shoulders touching, their legs pressed together. The only sounds were the fire's crackle and the muffled howl of the wind. Ellie's shivering slowly subsided. She was intensely aware of him, of the solid muscle of his thigh against hers, of the scent of him, wood smoke and something else, something wild and clean. His breathing was a low, steady rhythm beside her. "Why do you stay?" she whispered, her voice so quiet she barely heard it herself. "This is my home," he said. "No, I mean, why do you keep fighting? You know what they are. What the soldiers have, you saw my map. They have rifles, cannons, endless men. You cannot win." He was silent for a long time. "To win is not the only reason to fight," he said, his voice a rumble against her shoulder. "We fight to be who we are. We fight for the right to stand on this land, the land of our fathers. If we run, we are not Apache. We are just gone. I would rather die here than live in the white man's cage, begging for his scraps." His words struck her. She thought of her own small, suffocating cage in Dusty Creek. "I was dead there," she said, her voice catching. "In that town, I was just a ghost they all pointed at." He turned his head, his face now very close to hers. The firelight caught the high, hard line of his cheekbone. "You are not a ghost," he said. "I saw you, that day in the street. You were the only person in that town who was alive." The intensity of his gaze was a physical thing, a warm hand on her skin. Her heart, which she had thought was a cold stone, gave a painful, unsteady lurch. No one had ever looked at her like this. Not as a prize, not as a sin, but as a person, as a warrior. "I am afraid," she admitted, the confession torn from her. "Not of the storm. I am afraid of being alone." "You are not alone," he said. He did not plan it. She did not plan it. But the space between them had vanished. His hand, which had been resting on his knee, moved. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed her cheek, a touch so light it was like a whisper. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing. He smelled of smoke and the storm. He lowered his head. His lips met hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not the chaste peck of a suitor. It was hard and certain. A collision. It tasted of dust and fire and a desperate, shared loneliness. It was a promise of life, a defiant act against the storm and the world that wanted to kill them both. She did not pull away. Her hand came up, her fingers tangling in the thick hair at the nape of his neck. He made a sound, a low growl deep in his chest, and his arm, which had been at his side, came around her, pulling her against the hard wall of his chest. His other hand held her face, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. The kiss was everything. It was the rage of her betrayal and the grief of his. It was the terror of the mesa and the cold of the storm. And it was, underneath it all, a sudden, burning hope. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. The fire had burned low. The wind outside seemed to have faded to a distant moan. He looked at her, his eyes black and deep. He said her name, Ellie, and the way he said it made it sound like a prayer. He lowered his head again, and she met him, and the last of the light from the fire faded to embers, leaving them in a warm, shared darkness. The storm had broken by morning. They emerged from the cave into a world that had been scoured clean, the air cold and sharp. The walk back to the ruined camp was silent, but it was a new silence, filled with the unsaid things from the night. But the world did not wait. As they reached the camp, where people were already rebuilding, Ellie saw the looks. A young Apache woman, one who often brought Kohana his food, watched Ellie with eyes like black ice. Her name was Taza, and she had been promised to Kohana since they were children, before he had gone to the scouts. She looked at Ellie, then at Kohana, and with a look of pure hatred, she turned and walked away. The warriors, too, were grumbling. The scarred warrior, the one who had shoved Ellie, spoke to Naichi, his voice loud enough to be heard. He said Kohana was spending too much time with the white woman. He was thinking with the white man's head, not an Apache's heart. He was becoming soft. The tension was a new, sharp thing, and it was into this tension that the real news of the war arrived. A man stumbled into the camp, half dead from thirst, leading a foundering mule. He was not Apache, he was Mexican, a trader named Tom Rios, who sometimes traded tools and bullets with Naiche. He was terrified. He had been at the fort, delivering supplies, when he overheard Captain Briggs and Marshal Clay. They were not planning a patrol. They were planning an invasion. Briggs was massing every soldier he had. Clay had hired a small army of his own, 40 or 50 gunmen, telling them the government had placed a bounty on Apache scalps. They were not just planning to clear a few valleys. They were planning a war of extermination. They were going to march in 1 week. The news hit the camp like a physical blow. Naichi was enraged. He declared they would fight. They would not hide like women. They would meet the soldiers in the high passes, at the place called Red Canyon, and they would send every last one of them to their gods. This was their land, and they would die for it. The warriors, full of fear and anger, shouted in agreement. Only Kohana was silent. He looked at Naiche. "Brother," he said, his voice quiet. "They have too many. They have the repeating rifles. We have 40 warriors. They have 200. If we fight them there, you are right. We will all die, and the women and children will be left for them to slaughter." He proposed a different plan. He said they should run. They should take the old paths, the secret trails, and flee west into the Dragoon Mountains. To join with the other bands, he said they should move the women and children now, and the warriors could fight a delaying action, then melt away. To live, he argued, was to win. "That is the coward's way," Naichi roared. "That is the way of the white man. To run and trick an Apache stands." Ellie, who had been listening, her heart frozen, stepped forward. Both men turned to look at her, surprised. "He is right," she said, her voice shaking, but clear. "Kohana is right. You cannot win this. This is not a battle. It is a massacre. I drew the map. I know how they think. They will send soldiers in the front, and Clay's men will circle behind. They want to trap you in the canyon. It is what they did at Red Table. They are not coming to fight. They are coming to kill every living thing." Naiche's face was dark with fury. He stalked toward her until he was looming over her. "White woman," he snarled, his voice a lash. "Do not teach me how to live, and do not teach me how to die. We were fighting these wars before your people ever learned to cross the sea. Your words are wind." He turned his back on her, a sign of ultimate dismissal. Ellie's face went white, then red. She was shaking, but not with fear, with rage. "You are a fool, then," she said, her voice ringing out. The entire camp gasped. Naichi spun, his hand flying to his knife. But Ellie did not back down. She pointed a trembling finger, not at Naichi, but toward Dusty Creek. "You want to fight, then you are just as stupid as they are. You will die for his pride." She looked at Naichi. "And you will let him win." "What?" Then Kohana asked, his voice low, trying to stop the confrontation. "What other path is there, wise woman?" Ellie looked at him. The answer had been forming in her mind. A cold, terrible, perfect idea. "We do not run," she said, "and we do not fight. We cut the head off the snake." She looked at the assembled warriors. "You want to stop the army? You cannot, but you can stop Clay. He is the one who pays. He is the one who lies. Briggs is just a soldier, but Clay is the war." She turned to Kohana. "I am going back." His blood ran cold. "What?" "I am going back to Dusty Creek," she said, her voice certain. "I am going to get the proof. The letters in his office, his ledgers, the proof that he is hiring those men, that he is staging these raids. If we run, they will hunt us forever. If we fight, we die. But if I can get that proof to the judges in Tucson, to the newspapers, I can stop him. I can stop the entire war." Kohana stared at her as if she were mad. "No," he said, his voice absolute. "It is death. They will not throw you out this time. They will hang you." "They will if they catch me," Ellie said. She walked to him, and in front of the entire camp, she put her hand on his arm. "You showed me your home. Kohana, now let me show you how to fight in mine." Naichi argued. He raged against the plan, calling it a fool's errand, a suicide. But his was the only voice. The rest of the council, the other warriors, had seen the map Ellie drew. They had heard Kohana's quiet, steady support. This was a new kind of war, not fought for land, but for the truth. This was a white man's war, and she was their only guide. In the end, Naichi had agreed, his face a mask of bitter disapproval. He gave them 4 days. He gave them the traitor, Tom Rios, who was hiding with them and knew the town's underbelly, to guide them back. And he gave them his best scout, the one who had made the first report, the boy, Little Bear, his chest swelling with a pride that was greater than his fear. They left that same night, a small, desperate group of 4, Ellie, Kohana, the nervous Tom Rios, and the deadly quiet Little Bear. They moved only in the darkness, a reverse of the journey that had brought her to the valley. Then, she had been a prisoner, bathed in the brutal sun, moving away from a life she hated. Now, she was a hunter, shrouded in the cold of the moon, moving toward a life she despised even more. The roles were flipped. In the mountains, Ellie had been the child, weak and ignorant. Here, as they neared the flat, open territory surrounding Dusty Creek, she became the leader. Kohana, the man who could read the turn of a stone or the bend of a branch, was now blind. He and Little Bear were shadows, moving only when she told them to, their eyes wide with the unfamiliar, hostile terrain. "We wait here," Ellie whispered, her hand on Kohana's arm. They were huddled in a dry wash, a gully 2 miles from the town. It was the 3rd night. The lights of Dusty Creek were a faint, sickly yellow glow on the horizon. The army patrols ride this wash every night, around 3 in the morning, just before the moon sets. Kohana nodded, his face grim. He hated this. He hated the open sky, the smell of the white man's cattle, the feeling of being exposed. Little Bear was beside him, his knife in his hand, his young face trying to copy Kohana's impassive mask. Tom Rios was sweating. Despite the cold, he was a man who lived on the edges, a gambler and a sometimes gun. But this was different. He was helping the Apache. He was betraying Marshal Clay. He was, by all rights, a dead man. He kept touching the silver medallion he wore under his shirt. "They will pass in 10 minutes, Ellie said, her voice a low, certain thing. "Then we move. We have 2 hours before the town wakes up." She explained the town's rhythm, the late-night drunks, stumbling from the saloons, the changing of the watch at the marshal's office, the one deputy who always fell asleep on the porch of the general store. She laid out the town she had sketched in the dirt. But this time, she spoke of its habits, its breathing. They moved like ghosts, using the cover of a small creek. Then the shadows of the tannery, which smelled of chemicals and curing hides. They reached the edge of the town proper. It was exactly as she had left it, but it felt 100 times more dangerous. A banjo played a tinny, drunken tune from the largest saloon, the sound spilling out with the yellow lamplight. A man laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Tom," Ellie whispered, "you and Little Bear, go to the livery, find a place. Wait for Kohana. Do not move until he comes." Tom nodded, his face pale, and pulled the boy into the deeper shadows of the alley. Ellie turned to Kohana. "This is my part," she said. "I go with you," he said, his hand on his knife. "No, you cannot. You are Apache. If they see you, they will shoot, and they will ask questions later. If they see me, they will just think I am a whore, late for work." Her voice was bitter, but flat. "The doctor's house is 2 streets over. It is the only house with the green shutters. I will be back in 1 hour." He did not like it. His jaw was set. 1 hour, he said, "Then I come." She nodded. She pulled her hair free from its braid, letting it fall wild and unkempt. Around her face, she pulled her dress off one shoulder, making it look torn. She smudged dirt on her cheek. In the space of a minute, she transformed herself from Ellie Hart into the very woman the town had accused her of being, a broken, lost woman of the night. Then she stepped out of the alley and walked, not with fear, but with a weary stumble, toward the main street. She passed a man, his hat pulled low, leaning against a post. He looked up, his eyes taking in her disheveled state. He made a low, appreciative sound. "Lost. Little lady." Ellie did not answer. She just kept walking, her heart a cold stone. She reached the doctor's house and slipped around the back to the small door where Lydia received her patients. She knocked, a soft, frantic rhythm. A light appeared. The door opened a crack. Dr. Lydia Monroe stood there in her nightgown, a heavy pistol in her hand. Her face was lined with exhaustion. When she saw who it was, her jaw dropped. "Ellie," she whispered, as if seeing a ghost. "Lydia," Ellie breathed, and she stumbled forward, collapsing into the older woman's arms. They held each other for a long, sobbing moment. Lydia pulled her inside, bolting the door. "My God, child," she said, her hands flying over Ellie's face, her hair. They said you were dead. Clay told the whole town the Apache that God had passed his judgment on you." Ellie pulled back, her eyes dry and burning. "God's judgment," she said, her voice like broken glass. "Marshal Clay has no idea what God's judgment looks like, but he is about to find out." The story spilled out of her. The camp, Kohana, the plan. Lydia listened, her face growing paler, then harder. "It is worse than you know," Lydia said when Ellie finished. She went to her desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book, her medical ledger. "They brought in 2 survivors from that last wagon train. The one Clay blamed on the Apache." She opened the book, her finger tracing a line of neat, spidery script. "I treated them. They were shot. With rifles. Ellie, not arrows. And the wounds, the powder burns were from close range. An Apache does not fight like that." She turned a page. "And this, the body of the young cowboy Clay murdered? I recorded it as blunt force trauma, but I also recorded that I found a gold nugget in his pocket, a nugget he had been flashing in the saloon, saying he had found a new strike, up in the high valleys, the ones Clay wants." "It is proof," Ellie whispered. "It is a doctor's word against a marshal's," Lydia said grimly, "but it is a start." Meanwhile, Tom Rios was leading Kohana and Little Bear through a different set of shadows. He stopped at the massive shed behind the marshal's office, the one Ellie had mapped. "This is it," he whispered, pulling a ring of keys from his pocket. I have done work for Clay, moving things. He trusts me. He thinks I'm just a stupid, drunk Mexican." He found the key. The lock clicked, unnaturally loud in the silence. They slipped inside, pulling the door closed. The air was thick with the smell of axle grease, gunpowder, and whiskey. Kohana's eyes adjusted to the dark. He saw them, crates stacked to the ceiling. He used his knife to pry one open. Rifles. New, shiny, repeating rifles. Far too many for a town marshal. Little Bear, moving like a cat, was in the back. He let out a small, sharp hiss. Kohana joined him. In the corner, covered by a tarp, were boxes. Kohana opened one. Inside were silver candlesticks, bolts of silk, and bags of coffee. Stolen goods. And in the very back, Little Bear pulled aside a bloody canvas to reveal a stack of fresh scalps. They were blonde and red. White men's scalps. The evidence Clay was planting. "We have what we need," Kohana whispered, his voice deadly. A sudden beam of light cut through the crack in the door. "Heard a noise. I tell you," a voice slurred. Heard a click. Kohana, Tom, and Little Bear flattened themselves against the crates. The door creaked open. A deputy, his lantern held high, peered in. "See nothing," another voice said from outside. "You are drunk." The deputy stepped in, the lantern light sliding over the crates. His eyes had not adjusted. He was 3 feet from Little Bear. "Tom Rios, in a panic, knocked a crate. A bottle inside smashed." "Who is there?" the deputy yelled, fumbling for his pistol. Kohana moved. He did not kill. He struck a single brutal blow with his fist, driving the man into the wall. The deputy crumpled. "Go now," Kohana hissed. They burst out of the shed, running for the alley. The other deputy, the one outside, shouted and fired his pistol into the air. "Prisoner, no. Wait. It is the Apache, I see him. It is the Apache." Lights flashed on. Men shouted. A bell began to ring. Tom, Kohana, and Little Bear sprinted down the alley. 2 more deputies, drawn by the shot, appeared at the other end, blocking their path. Gunfire exploded in the narrow space. Kohana shoved Tom and Little Bear into a space between 2 buildings, shielding them with his body. A bullet tore a groove in the wooden wall where his head had been. Little Bear, his face a mask of terrifying calm, peeked around the corner. He had the deputy's pistol. He fired once. The shot was true. One of the deputies screamed and grabbed his shoulder, falling. "Tom, the livery go," Kohana ordered. Tom did not need to be told twice. He and Little Bear scrambled over a fence and were gone. Kohana waited 1 more second. Then he followed, disappearing into the darkness just as Marshal Clay himself, half-dressed but holding a shotgun, rounded the corner. Clay saw the fallen deputy. He looked at the open door of his warehouse. His face, in the torchlight, was a mask of pure murder. He knew. He had a traitor, and he had been robbed. "Double the guard," he roared. "Find that Mexican, find that long-haired Indian, and tell Captain Briggs, we are not waiting. We ride at dawn." Ellie was waiting in the shadows of the tannery, her heart in her throat. When Kohana appeared, he was breathing hard, and there was a dark, wet stain on his sleeve. "You are hurt," she gasped, grabbing his arm. "It is nothing," he growled. "A scratch from the wood. We have to go. The town is awake." He pulled her into the dark, ruined building. The smell of chemicals was choking. In the darkness, she fumbled for his arm, her hands finding the tear in his buckskin shirt. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice shaking. She tore a strip from her own petticoat. Her hands were surprisingly gentle as she wrapped the wound. It was a shallow graze, but it was bleeding. They stood in the darkness, the sounds of the roused town outside, shouts and horses. Their bodies were only inches apart. The air between them was thick, charged with the adrenaline of the escape, and with the memory of the storm. "Kohana," she started, her voice barely a whisper. He put a hand on her arm, silencing her. He looked down at her, his face a series of shadows in the faint moonlight coming through the broken roof. "If I die in this," he said, his voice a low, rough thing that she felt in her own chest. "If I do not see the sun rise from the mountains again, I want to know, does your heart have a place for me?" She looked at him, her breath caught. She saw his eyes, dark and searching. She saw the man who had cut her ropes, the man who had shared his fire and his kiss. She saw the warrior and the man. Her lips parted. She was about to answer. She was about to say yes. A horse clattered to a stop just outside the tannery. A beam of a lantern played over the walls. "Check in here," a man shouted. "He might have run this way." Kohana's hand flew to her mouth, and he pushed her, hard, back into the darkest corner, behind a stack of rotting hides. His body pressed against hers, shielding her, his arm a bar of iron across her waist. They stood, not breathing, as the footsteps entered the building, the light sweeping over the very spot they had just been standing. The lantern beam swept the darkness, missing them by inches. Kohana's body was a rigid wall, pressing Ellie into the rough, foul-smelling hides. His hand, smelling of gunpowder and sweat, was clamped over her mouth, and she could feel his heart hammering against her back. Or perhaps it was her own. A deputy stepped into the tannery, his boots crunching on the dried, salt-stiff floor. "Nothing in here but rats and rot," he called over his shoulder. "I am telling you." They went toward the livery. "Just check, you fool," the other man yelled. The deputy kicked a barrel, which rolled and smashed into the wall. He swept the light around one more time, his gaze passing over the stack of hides. He saw nothing. He spat on the floor. Waste of time. He walked out. The two men mounted their horses and galloped away, their voices fading. Kohana did not move for a full minute. He remained perfectly still, a statue of tense muscle, listening. Only when the last echo of the hooves was gone did he slowly, carefully, release her. He stepped back, and the air rushed into Ellie's lungs. She sagged against the wall, her legs shaking too hard to stand. His question still hung in the air, unanswered, lost in the alarm. "We have to go," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Tom and the boy will be at the wash. They will ride to the valley. We will not." "Where are we going?" she whispered, her throat raw. "Red Canyon," he said, checking the wound on his arm. The makeshift bandage was already dark. "Naichi moves the people. We move to the trap. The war is here. Ellie, it starts now." Dawn was a bloody smear in the east as Captain Harlan Briggs led his column out of the fort. He had 120 mounted soldiers, their blue uniforms sharp, their canteens full, their carbines loaded. Beside him, riding a heavy black gelding, was Marshal Everett Clay. Clay was not in his town suit. He was dressed in buckskin, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He looked the part of the frontiersman. Behind him rode his own army, 50 men scraped from the floors of the saloons and gambling halls, men with dead eyes and trigger-happy fingers. They were not soldiers. They were a pack of wolves, and Clay was their leader. Promised them government bounties for every Apache scalp they brought back. They rode toward Red Canyon, the place the Apache scout had intentionally let slip as the location of their new camp. It was a perfect trap. Briggs thought. A narrow entrance, high walls. He would send Clay's rabble in first to flush them out. Then his soldiers would cut them down as they fled. It was a clean, simple plan. He did not know that 3 miles behind him, a dusty carriage was racing to catch up. Inside sat 2 men. One was Judge Harlan, a man from Tucson known for his iron adherence to the law, his face grim and pale from the hard ride. The other was Mr. Davies, a journalist from the Eastern papers, a small, bespectacled man who clutched a heavy, box-like device wrapped in cloth. Dr. Lydia Monroe's message, carried by a rider who had nearly killed his horse, had been urgent. Marshal Clay and Captain Briggs are launching an unsanctioned war against the Chiricahua based on false reports. They mean to exterminate, not arrest. I have proof of murder and conspiracy. If you value the law, come. They ride for Red Canyon at dawn. They were late, but they were coming. In the high valleys, Naichi watched the last of the women and children disappear over a western ridge. His mother, the old, sharp woman had looked at him, and for the first time, he had seen fear in her eyes. He had nodded and told her to go with them, to keep them safe. His duty was here. He had listened to the white woman's plan. He had hated it, but his scouts had confirmed the numbers. A stand-up fight was suicide, but a fight to protect his people's retreat. That was an Apache's death. In the rocks above Red Canyon, Kohana lay on his stomach, his rifle resting on a ledge. The graze on his arm was a dull throb. He had tied it tight. Beside him, Little Bear was doing the same, his face painted with stripes of white and black clay. He was no longer a boy. He was a warrior. 10 others were spread out along the rim, a small, deadly force. Their orders simple: stop the soldiers, delay the hunters, and spill as much blood as possible for every foot of ground. Ellie was with them, but not as a fighter. She was 200 yards back, on a parallel ridge, with Lydia, the judge, and the journalist, who had arrived, gasping for breath. Just as the sun cleared the horizon, they had a clear view of the canyon floor below. Ellie's heart was a cold, hard stone. She had brought them here. She had to see it through. "There," Briggs said, pointing to the narrow mouth of the canyon. "They are in there. I can smell them." Clay spat into the dust. "My men will flush them. Send them in. Let us get this done." Briggs nodded to the captain of Clay's hunters. The man, a brute with a scarred face, yelled at his men. "First man to get a scalp gets a bonus $20 go." The pack of 50 gunmen surged forward, whooping and firing their pistols into the air. A disorganized, drunken charge. They rode into the canyon mouth. For a moment, there was silence. Then the first shot cracked from the ridgeline. It was a single, clean shot. The lead rider, the scarred man, threw his hands in the air and pitched forward from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Panic. The hunters' charge dissolved. They were riders, not soldiers, and they were in a box. More shots rang out, puffs of white smoke from rocks that had seemed empty. Men screamed. Horses reared. Falling, the bounty hunters turned and tried to flee, crashing into each other. A terrified mob. Briggs cursed. "Cowards, Captain. Send in your first platoon. Clean out those rocks forward." The blue-coated soldiers, more disciplined, rode in, carbines at the ready. They dismounted, forming a skirmish line, and began advancing, firing at the rocks. The battle had begun in earnest. The canyon filled with the roar of 1,000 echoes, the air thick with acrid smoke and red dust. "Look, the journalist, Davies," said, his voice shaking. He pointed. A small, rickety wagon, pulled by a single mule, was trying to flee the chaos. It had been on a small trail on the far side of the canyon. A Mexican family, a woodcutter perhaps, who had been caught in the middle of a war. A man, his wife, and a small child huddled in the back. Briggs' men, advancing, waved them back, but the man was in a panic, trying to turn his mule. Marshal Clay, who had been on the edge of the fight, his shotgun in his hands, saw them. His face was dark. They were witnesses. They had seen his men, his hired army. He could not have that. He spurred his horse forward. "Apache," he roared, pointing at the wagon. "They are with them. Get them!" He rode straight for the wagon, his horse bumping the terrified mule. The Mexican man held up his hands. "No, señor, por favor." Clay leveled his shotgun and fired. The blast threw the man from the wagon seat. The woman screamed, and Clay pulled his pistol, firing twice more. The screaming stopped. From the ridge, Ellie let out a sound, a dry, broken sob. "He killed them. He killed them." Lydia was writing in her book, her hand a blur. I see it all. "Mr. Davies," his face the color of ash, fumbled with the lens cap on his strange box. "My God," he whispered. "My God." He aimed the device, and a small flash of powder erupted, capturing the scene of the murder below. Kohana had seen it too. He had watched Clay ride down the family, and a red rage, hotter than any fire, had consumed him. He was no longer a scout. He was no longer a strategist. He was an avenger. He left his rifle. He took only his knife and his tomahawk. He stood, and in a movement that defied belief, he began to run, leaping from rock to rock, descending the sheer canyon wall like a striking snake. He landed in a narrow, dry wash at the bottom, shielded from the soldiers' bullets, and ran, his moccasins silent, straight for Clay. Clay, his shotgun still smoking, turned his horse, a satisfied smirk on his face. The horse suddenly screamed and reared. Kohana was there, having come from nowhere, his hand on the bridle. Clay was thrown from the horse, landing hard on his back. His shotgun skidded away. He looked up into the painted, demonic face of the Apache warrior, the man he had last seen on the mesa. "You," Clay gasped, fumbling for his pistol. Kohana kicked the pistol from his hand. He said nothing. His tomahawk was in his hand. Clay scrambled backward, his eyes wide with a fear he had never shown. He drew his own heavy Bowie knife. "Come on, you red dog," he bellowed. "I will gut you." They circled each other in the narrow wash, a world away from the main battle. It was a fight between two men, two worlds. Clay was bigger, a brute of a man. He lunged, his knife a silver blur. Kohana was faster. He moved like water, flowing around the attack, his tomahawk glancing off Clay's arm, drawing blood. Clay roared in pain and swung again. Ellie, on the ridge, had watched Kohana go. She had screamed his name, but he was gone. "I have to stop him," she cried. "Ellie!" "No, Lydia grabbed her." But Ellie was already running, scrambling down a narrow mule track, her feet slipping on the loose gravel. She had to stop it. Not the fight, the murder. She did not want Kohana to become the man Clay was. Below, the fight was brutal. Clay was tiring, but he was strong. He managed to grab Kohana, his thick arm wrapping around his throat, and they fell, rolling in the dust. Kohana lost his tomahawk. Clay was on top, his one hand on Kohana's throat, his other raising the knife for the final, killing thrust. "This is for my town!" Clay screamed, his face purple. "It was never your town," Kohana choked out, his hand finding a rock. He smashed it against Clay's temple. Clay grunted, his grip loosening. Kohana pushed him off, both men scrambling for a weapon. Clay saw it first. The pistol, the one Kohana had kicked away. It was lying just a few feet away. He lunged for it. He grabbed it, rolled, and aimed it at Kohana's back. Kohana. The scream came from above. Ellie was on a small ledge, 10 feet up, her face a mask of terror. Clay grinned. He would shoot the savage. Then the woman. He swung the pistol toward her. "No," she screamed. And she did not think. She jumped. She landed on Clay's back, a small, furious weight. The impact drove him forward, and the pistol went off, the sound deafening in the small space. The bullet, meant for Kohana, went wild, but it was not harmless. It tore through the flesh of Ellie's left shoulder, a white-hot poker that ripped a cry of pure agony from her lips. She fell from Clay's back, landing in a heap at Kohana's feet, her hand clutching the sudden, gushing wound. Kohana saw her fall. He saw the blood, and the last piece of his control, the part of him that was a man and not a storm, broke. He let out a roar, a sound that was not human. Before Clay could turn, Kohana was on him. He did not use a weapon. He used his hands. He slammed his fist into Clay's face, breaking his nose. He grabbed the marshal's arm, the one holding the gun, and twisted. A sickening snap of bone echoed in the wash. Clay screamed, a high, thin sound. The pistol clattered. Kohana was on top of him, his hands on the marshal's throat, his thumbs digging in. He was going to end this, end the man who had hurt her, the man who had destroyed everything. His knife was in his hand, the blade pressed to the soft skin under Clay's chin. He looked up to see if Ellie was... She was staring at him. Her face was pale as death, her dress dark with blood, but her eyes were wide, and they were pleading. "No," she whispered, the word a puff of air. "Justice, not this." Her words, her face, broke through the red haze. He looked at the man beneath him, the broken, whimpering, terrified man. He looked at Ellie. He raised his fist, and with all his remaining strength, he drove it into Clay's already broken face. The marshal went limp, unconscious. The battle above had reached its own crescendo. Captain Briggs, seeing his bounty hunters routed and his soldiers pinned, had lost his military mind. He was screaming, his face a blotchy red. "Fire, burn them out! Fire at the rocks! Kill them all! Damn you!" he shrieked, riding his horse back and forth behind the line. His men, unnerved, were firing wildly, their bullets sparking off the rocks. They saw the Mexican wagon, saw the bodies. They saw their captain, mad with bloodlust. They began to hesitate. I said fire. Briggs roared, and he drew his own pistol, firing it into the air. A shot, one of his own men's, fired in a panic, struck the canyon wall just above Briggs's head. The lead bullet flattened, ricocheted, and flew back with a vicious whine. It struck Captain Harlan Briggs in the throat. He made a sound, a wet, surprised gurgle. He looked down, his hand going to the new, impossible hole in his neck. He stared at his men, his eyes wide with shocked betrayal. Then, slowly, he toppled from his horse and lay still in the red dust. Silence. The soldiers, seeing their commander fall, stopped firing. The Apache snipers, their job done, faded back into the rocks. The quiet that fell on Red Canyon was heavier, more profound than any noise had been. It was filled with the smell of powder and copper and the soft, terrible sound of men weeping. Into this silence rode the judge, his face a granite mask, and Mr. Davies, his camera in his hand. Kohana emerged from the wash, dragging the unconscious form of Everett Clay. He pulled him into the open and dropped him at the feet of the stunned soldiers. Ellie, clutching her shoulder, staggered out after him, supported by Dr. Lydia Monroe, who had run down the trail, her medical bag in hand. The war was over. The massacre had been stopped, but the cost was written in the blood that soaked the canyon floor. The journey back to Dusty Creek was a funeral procession. The bodies of Captain Briggs and the fallen soldiers were draped over their horses, led by a stunned and leaderless platoon. Judge Harlan rode at the front, his face a mask of cold fury. Beside him, Mr. Davies clutched his precious box of photographic plates, his other hand scribbling in a notebook. In the center of the column, Marshal Everett Clay was tied to his own saddle, his hands bound in front of him, his broken arm in a crude splint. His face was a swollen, purple ruin, his one good eye darting about, calculating, still trying to find a way out. Behind him, Ellie rode a gentle army mare, her left arm in a sling, her shoulder a universe of throbbing pain. Dr. Lydia Monroe had cleaned and stitched the wound in the field, her face grim. Kohana walked beside her horse. He had refused to ride. He walked as a guard, his eyes never leaving Clay, his presence a silent, powerful threat that kept the other bounty hunters, now disarmed and under arrest, in a state of cowed terror. Naichi, Little Bear, and the other warriors had vanished. They had faded back into the mountains to find their people, their faces unreadable. Only Kohana remained, his own self-appointed judge and jailer. When the column entered the main street of Dusty Creek, the townspeople came out of their homes and saloons, expecting to see a victorious army. Instead, they saw a defeated platoon, their dead captain, and their marshal bound like a common criminal. And they saw Ellie Hart, alive, riding with the soldiers, a white woman who had been given to the savages and had now returned, with a savage walking at her side. The whispers started, a low, shocked, fearful sound. Judge Harlan did not wait. He did not go to the marshal's office. He pointed his finger at the small, steeple-topped church. "There," he commanded. "We will have this hearing in the house of God. It seems the most appropriate place." They filed in, the pews scraping, the air thick with disbelief. The soldiers, grim-faced, stood guard. Clay's captured gunmen were pushed into the back pews. Marshal Clay was hauled to the front and shoved into the front pew, a soldier with a rifle standing over him. The townspeople crowded in, their faces a mix of confusion, anger, and a dawning, terrible understanding. The pastor stood by his pulpit, his face pale, wringing his hands. Judge Harlan stood at the front, his hat in his hand. "People of Dusty Creek," he said, his voice filling the small, hot building, "you have been the victims of a great and terrible lie." He nodded to Mr. Davies, the journalist, who stood. "Marshal Clay," the judge said, his voice ringing, "you are accused, by the authority of the Arizona Territory, of murder, of inciting a war for your own profit, and of fraud against the United States government." Clay surged to his feet, his handcuffs rattling. "This is a lie," he roared, his voice hoarse. "It is her, that woman. She is the traitor." He pointed a thick bound finger at Ellie, who was sitting in the side pew, Dr. Monroe beside her. "She colluded with the savages," Clay bellowed. "She betrayed her people. She set this whole thing up. She is a whore and a liar, and she has bewitched you all." The air in the church froze. Every eye turned to Ellie. She was pale, her dress stained with her own blood and the dirt of the canyon. But her eyes were not the eyes of the woman who had left. They were clear and hard as blue steel. She stood up. The pain from her shoulder made her wince, but she did not falter. Kohana, who had been standing by the door, took 2 steps inside, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. He would not interfere, but he would watch. Ellie walked slowly into the center aisle. She did not look at the judge. She looked at the people of her town. She saw their faces. Mrs. Gable, the inn mistress, the merchant who had wanted to buy her, the pastor who had condemned her. "He is right about one thing," Ellie said, her voice quiet, but it carried in the silence like a bell. "I am not the same woman who left here. You all saw to that." She turned to the pastor. "You stood at that pulpit," she said, her voice gaining strength, "and you told this town I was a sinner. You told them I was a source of rot, and you told them that to save themselves, they must throw me away." She turned to the townspeople. "And you did. You watched. You called it God's judgment. You gave me to the Apache, a gift, like a bag of spoiled grain. To the men you called savages." The murmuring began, a low sound of shame and denial. "But Marshal Clay," she said, turning to him, "he did not just want to throw me away. He wanted to start a war. He wanted the Apache land, the land that young cowboy found silver on, the one he beat to death in the street, in front of all of you." "Lies," Clay shouted. "Dr. Monroe," the judge said. Lydia stood, her medical ledger in her hand. "I examined the body of Jack Coulter, the cowboy," she said, her voice clear. "He was not just beaten, he was murdered. And I have in my log that he had been showing Marshal Clay a map to a claim in the high valleys. The same day, Marshal Clay tried to buy him out. Jack refused." She held up the book. "And I have the records. The men from the wagon train, the ones Marshal Clay claimed were killed by Apaches. The bullets I took from their bodies were from a Winchester rifle. The powder burns showed they were shot at point-blank range. It was an execution, not a raid." The judge nodded. "Mr. Davies?" The journalist stepped forward. He held up a plate of glass, the image still faint. "I have a photograph," he said, his voice trembling with the import of it. "Taken at Red Canyon not 3 hours ago. It shows Marshal Clay, with his own pistol, murdering a Mexican family in their wagon, a man and his wife, as they tried to flee. He then shouted that it was the Apache." A woman in the back of the church gasped, a sound like she was being strangled. "And, Mr. Davies said, at the request of Judge Harlan, I also accompanied the soldiers to the marshal's warehouse, the one that was broken into last night." He held up a canvas bag. It was full of scalps, blonde hair, red hair. These were found inside. The bounty scalps Marshal Clay was going to use as proof of the Apache massacre. The church erupted. Men were standing, shouting, pointing. The pastor sank onto his bench, his face in his hands. "And where did you get the key to that warehouse?" Clay screamed, his one good eye landing on Tom Rios, who was huddled near the back. You filthy, traitorous Mexican, I will see you hang." Tom Rios looked like he was going to be sick, but he stood, his hands shaking. He paid me," Tom whispered, his voice cracking. "He paid me and my friends to dress as Apache, to burn the ranches. He said it would just scare people, that it would bring the army. I did not know. Enough!" The judge's voice cut through the noise. He looked at the two silent figures by the door. "Naichi, of the Chiricahua, has left, but Kohana remains. Do you have words to speak?" Kohana walked forward. He stood beside Ellie. He was not a citizen. He was not a part of this world, but he was a part of this. He looked at the judge, but he spoke to the room. "I was a scout for your army," he said, his English slow and deliberate. "I wore the blue coat. I ate the white man's food. I believed the words of peace. Captain Briggs, the man who is now dead, was my captain. I led him. I trusted him." He looked at the soldiers, and he and the men he served rode into my village while I was gone. A village of old men and women and children, a village under a white flag. They killed them all, for the land. They called it a mistake. He turned his gaze to Clay. "This man is not new. He is just you. He is the man who takes what is not his. He is the man who lies, and calls his lie the law. You gave us the woman you did not want, and in that, you told the truth for the first time. You do not want anything that is good. You only want what you can break, and what you can sell." He said nothing more. He stepped back, a shadow, and stood beside the pew. The silence that followed was profound. Every lie had been stripped away. The town of Dusty Creek saw itself in that hot, dusty church, and the image was horrifying. Judge Harlan looked at Ellie. His voice was softer now, tired. "Miss Hart," he said, "you have been wronged. By this man, and by this town. You have seen a war, and you have stopped it. Now, you must tell me, what do you want? What is justice to you? Do you want us to drive the Apache from this land, to make it safe?" Ellie looked at the judge. She looked at the floor. She thought of the ride, of the camp, of the storm. She thought of the man beaten to death in the street, and the family murdered in their wagon. She looked up, and her gaze was clear. "I want justice," she said. "I want Everett Clay to be tried by the laws he pretended to uphold. I want him to pay for the boy he murdered, and the family he shot, and the war he started." She turned, and she looked at the people of her town. "And I want you to look at him. I want you to see him, and see yourselves. You let this happen? You were so afraid of the savages out there. You did not see the monster right here, in your own church, wearing a star." "I do not love this town," she said, her voice breaking, but not with tears, with strength. "I do not love this false, hateful world that you built, the one that threw me away because I would not be quiet, the one that values land and gold over the lives of men." She took a step, and she did. "This is a critical moment. I must write this." She stood next to Kohana. "You asked me what I want. Judge," she said, "I want the Apache to be seen as people, as the people they are, the ones who, when they were given the woman no one wanted, did not see trash. They saw a person. She looked at Kohana. "He saw me, and he gave me a choice, when my own people gave me none." And in front of the pastor, the judge, and the entire town that had condemned her, Ellie Hart reached out and took Kohana's hand. His hand was rough and warm, and it closed around hers, a solid, living anchor. The town gasped as one. This was the true sin. This was the line that could not be crossed. But Ellie did not care. She had crossed it, and she was not coming back. Judge Harlan stared at their joined hands for a long moment. He nodded, slowly. "So be it," he said. He turned to the soldiers. "Marshal Everett Clay, you are relieved of your duties and under arrest for the murders of Jack Coulter and of the Juarez family. You will be taken to Tucson, where you will stand trial. And," he added, his voice like iron, "I will personally recommend the gallows." As the soldiers dragged the screaming, cursing Clay from the church, the judge turned to Kohana. "The army has lost its commander. This has been a terrible mistake. I will send word to Tucson. I will propose a new treaty, a protected parcel of land, a reservation, in your own valleys, where you can live in peace, if your people will stop the raids." Naichi, he thought, would be skeptical, but Kohana looked at Ellie. At her hand in his, he saw the wound on her shoulder, a wound she had taken for him. He saw a life that was not just running, not just fighting. He saw a future. "We do not want war," Kohana said. "We just want our home." That night, the army camped outside the town, with Clay and irons. The townspeople, shamed and silent, had retreated to their homes. A fire burned in a small grove of cottonwoods by the stream, outside the town limits. Ellie sat by that fire, her shoulder clean and rebandaged by Lydia. Kohana sat across from her, sharpening his knife, the sound a soft, rhythmic scrape. The question he had asked in the tannery still hung in the air between them, unanswered. Ellie finally spoke. "You saved my life," she said to the fire. "You saved mine," he answered, not looking up. "You saved my soul," she said, and he stopped. He looked at her. She met his gaze. Her heart, which she had thought was dead, now aching with a feeling so new, so powerful. It terrified her. "When they gave me to you," she said, "I was nothing. I was a ghost. You gave me a chance to live." She stood up, and she walked around the fire, and she stood before him. He rose to his feet, a shadow, tall and silent. "I want to give you a chance to love," she said, her voice shaking, but she did not look away. "If you want it." He did not answer with words. He reached out, his hand infinitely gentle, and his fingers touched the bandage on her shoulder. A question. She leaned into his touch, a silent yes. His other hand came up, and he cupped her face. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers in the firelight, and he saw his own future. He saw his home. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. It was not the kiss of the storm, all desperation and survival. This was slow and deep, and it was a promise. It was a choice. His arms went around her, pulling her close, and her good arm wrapped around his neck, her hand in his hair. They stood, two broken people from two broken worlds, healing each other in the light of a single fire, under a vast, starry sky. The future was not certain. The peace was not guaranteed. But Ellie had chosen her side, and Kohana had chosen not to be alone. And for now, in the wild heart of the West, that was enough. The fall came, painting the cottonwoods in the high canyons a brilliant, aching yellow. 6 months had passed since the blood had dried in Red Canyon. 6 months since Marshal Everett Clay had been taken to Tucson in chains, his trial a scandal that had echoed all the way back east, his execution a stark and final sentence. Dusty Creek was a different town. The power that Clay had held in his one meaty fist was gone, leaving a vacuum that the townspeople, frightened and leaderless, did not know how to fill. They were quieter now, their gossip muted, their judgments less certain. They had seen the monster that lived among them, and the mirror that Ellie Hart had held up to their faces had left a permanent, ugly reflection. The army, too, had changed, with Captain Briggs gone and his atrocities laid bare by the journalist, Mr. Davies. The new commander was a cautious man. The aggressive patrols into Apache territory had ceased, replaced by a wary, defensive perimeter. Judge Harlan's proposed treaty was being debated, a slow, grinding process of bureaucracy. But for now, there was a fragile, unwritten peace. Kohana and Ellie had not returned to Dusty Creek to live, nor had they stayed in Naichi's main camp. They had found their own place. It was a narrow valley, a green ribbon hidden between two towering stone ridges, fed by a stream that never ran dry. It was halfway between the white man's town and the Apache's mountain strongholds. It was a place that belonged to neither, and therefore to both. When Kohana had asked Naichi for the valley, the chief had been silent for a long time. He looked at Kohana, and he looked at the white woman who now stood at his side, her shoulder healed but for a puckered, silver scar. Naichi had finally nodded. He had called it the Indiago Teal, the neutral valley. It would be a buffer, a place for truce. Their home was simple. Kohana, with the help of Tom Rios and Little Bear, had built a small cabin, half rock, half timber, solid against the wind. It stood near a wickiup, a sign of the two worlds they now inhabited. Ellie's name, once a curse, was now spoken with a strange respect in Tucson. The articles by Mr. Davies had painted her as a woman of incredible courage, a frontier Joan of Arc who had faced down savagery in all its forms. Judge Harlan himself had used her testimony, and Dr. Lydia's meticulous ledgers, to secure Clay's conviction. When the government men, or the new army command, needed to speak with Naichi, they did not ride into the mountains. They sent word to the neutral valley. Ellie and Kohana became the bridge, the translators not just of words, but of worlds. Ellie, who understood the white man's laws and his greed, and Kohana, who understood the Apache's heart and his bond with the land. 1 month after they had settled, a wagon had arrived. Atop it sat Dr. Lydia Monroe, her face set with determination. She had sold her practice in Dusty Creek. She told Ellie she was tired of healing a town that was sick in its soul. At the edge of the valley, where the trail from Dusty Creek began, they built her a new clinic. It was just 2 rooms, built of sod and timber, but it was clean, and it was open to all. Apache women, whose children were sick with fever, came to her. Mexican families, like the one Tom Rios belonged to, came for their wounds. Even poor white settlers, miners and ranchers who had been pushed to the margins, found their way to her door. She healed them all, her ledger filling with new names, a testament to a different kind of community. The land, however, did not care for their peace. The winter had been dry, the snows light, the spring was hot, and the summer was a trial. The stream in their valley shrank, and the crops they had planted withered. The air grew thick with dust, and the sky was a relentless, pale blue. Then the rains came. It came not as a blessing, but as a judgment, a dark, purple cloud bank built over the mountains for 2 days. And then it broke. The rain was a solid wall of water. The dry, baked earth could not drink it. The small stream in the neutral valley became a raging, brown torrent in an hour. But in the main Apache camp, in the high canyon, it was a catastrophe. The water, funneled by the rock walls, became a flash flood, a 10-foot-high wave of mud, boulders and uprooted trees that tore through the village. A runner, half drowned, made it to Kohana's cabin in the middle of the night. The camp was gone. People were missing. Naichi himself was trapped with a dozen others on a high ledge, the water rising. Kohana did not hesitate. He gathered Tom Rios, Little Bear, and 2 other men. He looked at Ellie. "Stay here. Keep the fire. We will bring them back." "You need more help," she said, her face grim. She was already pulling on her boots. "They will be cold and wounded. They need Lydia, and they need blankets." "We have no more," he said. "Dusty Creek does," she said. She rode, not to the clinic, but down the main trail, pushing her horse through the driving rain. She rode into the town that had cast her out, a lone, desperate figure. She did not stop at the inn. She rode straight to the new sheriff's office and hammered on the door. When he opened it, He saw Ellie Hart, soaked to the skin, her eyes blazing. "The Apache camp has been destroyed," she said, her voice a command, not a request. "There are women and children in the flood. I need blankets, I need flour, and I need men." The sheriff hesitated. The old fear was still there. "They are people," Ellie shouted, her voice breaking. "They are drowning. Are you going to be the town that let Everett Clay define you, or are you going to be the town that lives?" She did not wait for his answer. She went to the mercantile, to the church. She roused the town, and to her astonishment, the fear in their faces was slowly replaced by something else, a grim sense of duty. By morning, Kohana, having led a daring rescue across the raging water, was bringing the first of the survivors down to the neutral valley. They were cold, broken, and in shock. They found Dr. Lydia's clinic ablaze with light, a fire roaring in the hearth. And they found Ellie, not alone, but with the sheriff of Dusty Creek and 3 other men, unloading a wagon full of dry blankets, coffee, and sacks of flour. Naiche was the last to arrive, his arm broken, his face a mask of grief for the 2 children they had lost. He saw his people, his warriors, his wife, wrapped in blankets that smelled of the white man's store. He saw the sheriff pouring a hot cup of coffee for Little Bear. He looked at Ellie, who was helping Lydia bind a woman's cut. He looked at Kohana, who was organizing the chaos. He said nothing. He just sat by the fire, a man whose world had been saved by the very people he had been taught to hate. The flood changed him. The rigid pride gave way to a grudging wisdom. He saw that Kohana had been right. To live was to win. A month later, when the camp had been rebuilt on higher ground, Naiche came to the neutral valley. He brought Little Bear with him. He walked to the small, 1-room cabin where Ellie was teaching Tom Rios's young daughter her letters. He stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing figure. "This writing," he said, his voice rough. "It is a white man's trick." "It is a way to remember," Ellie said quietly, not looking up. "I want him to learn," Naiche said. Ellie looked up, stunned. Naiche pushed Little Bear forward. The boy looked terrified, but also excited. "He will learn the words," Naiche said, "but he will not forget the bow. He will read your books, but he will not forget the earth." Little Bear sat on the floor, and Ellie gave him a piece of slate. He was a symbol of the new world they were all building, one of tradition and one of change. Ellie's relationship with Dusty Creek found its own strange peace. She would ride in for supplies, for mail that now came for her from Tucson. Some people, the ones who had been most vocal in her condemnation, still looked away, their faces dark with shame. But others, tentatively, would nod. "Mrs. Hart," they would call her, a title of respect she had never had before. She was not Mrs. Hart, but she did not correct them. One day, an older woman, her face worn with grief, stopped her outside the mercantile. It was the mother of Jack Coulter, the young cowboy Clay had murdered. The woman just stood there for a moment, her hands twisting in her apron. Then she said, I want to thank you. You gave my boy justice. You spoke for him when we were all too afraid." She reached out and touched Ellie's arm, the one with the scar. "God bless you, child," she whispered. Ellie looked at the woman's face, and the last hard knot of hatred in her own heart finally dissolved. It was not forgiveness, not entirely. It was understanding. They had been weak, and she had been strong, and that was the only difference. She put her own hand over the woman's. "We spoke for him," she said, and she left. That evening, the 4 of them sat outside the clinic. Ellie, Kohana, Dr. Lydia, and Naiche, who had come down to share a meal. They watched the children, a small mix of Apache and Mexican, playing a game with a ball by the stream. Little Bear was with them, showing them how to set a small snare, then puzzling over the slate Ellie had given him. "They need more," Lydia said, her eyes on the children. More than I can give them. More than you can. Ellie. They need a place, Ellie said, a real place to learn. Kohana looked at Nietzsche. A school, he said, the word sounding strange in his mouth. Naichi grunted. He looked at the children. He saw the future. A school. He agreed. But not a white school. Not a place that teaches them to hate who they are. A place that teaches them what they are, Ellie said, her eyes bright with a new idea. A place to learn reading and writing, and a place to learn how to track and how to read the sky. A place to learn your history, Nietzsche, and a place to learn Lydia's medicine. A place for all of them, together. They looked at the small, flat patch of land between the clinic and the cabin. It was a good spot, solid and defensible. With a view of the stream, they were building more than a home. They were building a legacy. 2 years passed. The snows of 2 winters melted into the stream, and the suns of 2 summers baked the red rock of the ridges. The neutral valley, which had been only a promise, became a place. The small, strong cabin that Kohana had built now had a neighbor, another, larger cabin that served as the schoolhouse. Dr. Lydia Monroe's clinic had a small, neat garden of herbs, and the Apache families, seeing the wisdom in staying near the water and the medicine, had built a cluster of sturdy wickiups on the far side of the stream. There was a corral, holding 2 army mares, a mule, and a dun-colored Mustang that Little Bear had spent a year gentling. A field of corn, planted Apache style, stood tall in the summer heat, and Ellie's own garden, behind her cabin, was heavy with squash and beans. At the entrance to the valley, where the trail from Dusty Creek met the path to the high mountains, there was a sign. Kohana had carved it from a thick plank of pine, and Ellie had painted the letters, black and clear. It did not name a town or a territory. It said simply, Free Valley, a home for all who respect it. Life had taken root in the hard soil. Inside the cabin, the midday heat was a drowsy, warm blanket. Ellie sat in a rocker, not the one from her mother's inn, but one Tom Rios had built for her, his hands surprisingly skilled. She was not alone. She held her son, a boy of 1 year, who was sleeping against her chest. He was a beautiful child, with his father's thick, straight black hair and his mother's eyes, a startling, deep blue that looked almost purple in the shade. Kohana sat on the floor near them, his back against the wall, his hands busy. He was not mending tack or sharpening a knife. He was weaving a small, intricate talisman of horsehair and leather. He was silent, watching his wife and son. His face, which she had once thought was a mask of cold anger, now softened in the quiet light. He was working a small, bright blue piece of turquoise into the leather, and a single, small eagle feather. The baby stirred, his small hand fisting in his mother's dress. He will need this, Kohana said, his voice a low rumble. He held up the small amulet. It is beautiful, Ellie said, her hand reaching out to touch it. It is his story, Kohana said. He touched the turquoise. This is the stone of the sky. To protect him. Our people have used it for 1,000 years. He touched the eagle feather. This is the feather of the high flyer, the one who sees all. It will give him the spirit of the Apache. He paused, and he looked at her, his eyes serious. And this, he said, touching the piece of cured, light-colored horsehair, is from the mane of your mare, the one that carried you back from Dusty Creek. It is his white blood. It is his mother's courage. He tied the final knot. He is 2 people. He is not half of one, and half of the other. He is whole. He is Apache, and he is your people. Neither one is less than the other. He must know this. He must never be made to feel shame, as I was, or as you were. Ellie looked down at the child, her heart so full it ached. She remembered the cold pews of the church, the whispers, the judgment. She remembered the feeling of being nothing, of being a stain. She leaned forward and kissed her son's forehead. You do not belong to their world, she whispered to the sleeping child. And you do not belong only to the mountains. You belong to yourself, Adam, and you belong to us. The schoolhouse was the loudest place in the valley. It was a single, long room, with a fieldstone fireplace at one end and a row of high windows at the other. It always smelled of chalk, wood smoke, and the sharp, herbal scent of the medicines Lydia kept in the corner. Inside, the sound was a strange, new music. It was the sound of a dozen children, their voices a mix of Apache, Spanish, and halting, unpracticed English. Dr. Lydia Monroe, her hair grayer now, but her back just as straight, was at the front, explaining in simple terms why water from the stream must be boiled before drinking. She was using a piece of charcoal to draw a picture of the tiny, invisible bugs that lived in it, and the children were looking at her as if she were a powerful witch. Come, I must write this, for it is the heart of the matter. She, too, was a teacher, but her classroom was not inside. He stood with a group of 6 children, ranging in age from 7 to 12. 2 were Apache. 3 were Mexican children of the families that had moved near the valley for protection, and 1 was the pale, freckled son of a white rancher who had lost his wife and brought his boy to Lydia for healing, and had simply stayed. The earth is talking, Kohana said. He was crouched, pointing at the ground. You are not listening. You are making too much noise with your feet, and with your mouths. The children fell silent. Look, he said, pointing to a patch of soft dirt. What is this? The white boy, Billy, squinted. It is a track, a deer. No, Kohana said, his voice patient. A deer track is split. This is round. This is Pinda, the coyote. He passed this way this morning. He is light. He is not hunting. He is going to his den. And this, he pointed to a single, tiny, gray feather, is from the dove he ate last night. The children stared, wide-eyed. You read her books, he said, nodding toward the schoolhouse. That is good. That is the white man's talking. But this, he swept his hand across the canyon. This is the Endy's book. It is the book of the people. You must learn to read both, or you will be blind in one eye. The children, in this strange, new world, were thriving. They had formed their own fierce, mixed-blood tribe. Ellie, watching from the cabin doorway, smiled as she saw the little Apache girl, the one who had once mocked her, now teaching Billy how to weave a water basket. The girl saw the Mexican boy's tight, curly hair, and she reached out, fascinated, and gave it a playful tug. The boy yelped and chased her, and they collapsed, laughing. This was the legacy, not the blood spilled in the canyon, but this laughter. The world outside still churned. The mail rider, who now made a stop at the valley once a month, had brought a letter from Tucson, and with it, a folded newspaper from the East. The letter was from Mr. Davies, the journalist. His articles and his shocking photograph of Clay's murders had done their work. He wrote that the Congressional Committee in Washington had used his reports and the testimony of Judge Harlan to open a full investigation into the Army's conduct in the Arizona Territory. He wrote, Your voice, Mrs. Hart, and yours, Kohana, were heard. They are asking questions. They are debating the treaties. It is not won. The greed for land is still a sickness here. Naichi, I hear, still does not trust the white man's paper, and I cannot say I blame him. But the seeds you planted have taken root. They are asking questions, and that is the beginning of everything. Ellie folded the letter. Injustice was not dead. The world was not fixed, but a small, clear light had been lit in a very dark place. That night, after the baby was asleep, after the valley had fallen into the deep, velvet quiet of the high desert, Ellie stood on the small porch of her cabin. Kohana came to stand beside her. The air was cool, smelling of pine and the dust of the horses. They looked down at their creation. A few lights still burned, one in Lydia's clinic, where she was likely reading a small campfire from the wiki-ups, where a low, soft song was being sung. The sound of the stream was a constant whisper. They stood in a comfortable silence, a silence that had grown between them, built of shared work, shared fears, and the long, quiet nights in each other's arms. Kohana finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, almost part of the night itself. "The day they gave you to me as a disposable thing," he said, his gaze on the valley. "I thought I was saving one life. I was young and proud. I did not know you would save mine." Ellie turned her head, looking at his strong profile against the stars. She felt the familiar ache in her heart, the one that was no longer pain, but a deep, profound love. "They gave you the woman no one wanted," she whispered, her hand finding his fingers, rough and strong, closed around hers. "Only you saw a person." He turned to her, and his other hand came up, his thumb brushing the scar on her shoulder, the one she had taken for him. "I saw you, Ellie," he said. "I saw your fire. It was the same fire that burns in the heart of the eagle. It was the fire of a free spirit. I just gave it air to breathe." He drew her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, his arm a solid, warm circle around her. "This," the man from the Old West thought, "this is how a world is truly built. The West was not won by gunpowder and steel. It was not won by the men who came to take. It was built by the abandoned, the broken, the outcasts. It was built by the people who had been thrown away, and who, in the scorched dust, had found each other. They had learned that freedom was not a thing given by a government or a king. It was a thing you built, plank by plank, stone by stone, with your own two hands. It was a thing you paid for, in blood and in sorrow. But it was the only thing worth having. It was the only way to truly live, not just to exist." Down in the corral, the dun-colored Mustang, the wild horse that had been gentled but never broken, stamped its foot and nickered softly. In the cabin, their son, the boy of two bloods, slept safely. And high above the valley, on a thermal current that Ellie could not see but Kohana could feel, a lone eagle circled, its cry a sharp, clear note of freedom, echoing off the canyon walls. Where the world had called them savage and disposable, they had built a home, and sometimes that is enough to change a wilderness. Thank you all so much for listening to this story. I would love to know your thoughts, and especially where in the world you are listening from. So please leave a comment down below and let us connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to the channel, Wild West Tales, and to give this video a like. And if you really want to support us, hit that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks. We appreciate every single one of you.